Good day, Lausanne, Europe. My name is Israel Olofinjana, one of the directors at the Evangelical Alliance, the director of One People Commission, which is a network initiative that works in the areas of unity and diversity, working with several churches like Latin American churches, South Korean churches, South Asian churches, African and Caribbean churches, and African churches. So it's really an exciting role. And today I want to talk to you about getting to know the diaspora people of Europe. And so in this session, you'll be hearing from myself, from Dr. Samuel Cueva, who will talk about the Latin American perspectives in terms of diaspora in Europe, and Henry Liu from Chinese Overseas Christian Mission will be sharing about Chinese diaspora. So I'll be looking at the African diaspora Christians in the European space and context. And so I want to start by saying three things I would like to share in this, and one is a bit of a history of African diaspora Christians in the European context. Second is the diversity of this constituency. And then the third is how can you as Europeans engage African Christians in Europe? So a bit of a history. Oftentimes people think African diaspora in Europe that they are a latecomer, coming to maybe UK or other parts of Europe in the 60s, but actually this is not really correct. African Christians have been in the European space for such a long time. Actually, will it surprise you to say that we've had 3 African popes in the past? There you go. 3 African popes in the past, dating back to around the 1st century, or between the 1st and 3rd century in that sense. But moving forward, we will talk about the enslavement of Africans. And so that history of enslavement brought together European history and African history. And part of what that means is that you have Africans being in European spaces. And so some of the ex-slaves started actually ministering in the European context. So you have someone like Olaudah Equiano, you have someone like Otoba Kogwana, who were all African Christians who were working with William Wilberforce in the abolition of the slave trade. But actually, one of the first African churches to be founded in Europe was founded by an ex-slave called John G., who was from Calabar in Nigeria. And he founded a church in Portsmouth here in the UK between 1807 and 1815. Now that is quite remarkable in itself. And then moving forward, around 1906, we have another Ghanaian businessman who came from Ghana in 1901 and founded a Pentecostal church in Peckham in southeast London in 1906. And so by the time we get to the 1940s, we have what we called African Caribbeans coming from Caribbean to resettle in the UK, but also to rebuild the UK economy after the devastation of the Second World War. Now, many came, but they planted churches because some of them were rejected as it is in several church spaces. And so many of them founded Pentecostal and holiness churches. But that's not the only reason why they founded these churches. There were other reasons, like the coldness of European Christianity or British Christianity in that space led to some of them coming from a Pentecostal expression to a kind of a historic church space where they feel constrained, so many of them felt they needed to start something. Lastly is mission in that sense. But what a bit of this history tells us is that African diaspora in the European space is not a newcomer. So when we talk about the concept of diaspora missiology, we start getting ground around 2010. Africans have been engaging in this way before that. And so it's just important to mention that history. And so when we look at the major cities across Europe, whether you look at Amsterdam, whether you look at Rome, whether you look at Brussels, whether you look at Frankfurt, Berlin, you will see African churches all across in that sense. But that leads me to the second question. That's just a bit of a history. And so the second point is, when we use the term African churches, what do we actually mean? Because oftentimes it could sound as if African churches are a homogeneous unit. But that is far from the case. African churches are very diverse. There are African churches that are from the Caribbean. There are African churches that are from Africa. And they are very distinct in their ecclesiology and in their mission approach in that sense. There are also African churches that started independently in the European space, not having any headquarter churches either in the Caribbean or Africa, but just started spontaneously and independent as a work of the Spirit. But there are also African churches that will be regarded as African indigenous churches. Now, these are churches that reacted to colonial Christianity in Africa around the beginning of the 20th century when Europeans were preaching the gospel in different parts of Africa. And so with the preaching of that gospel in Africa, many were not encouraged to use African languages, African drums, African clothing, African preachers in that sense. So there was a reaction. And so this led to the first wave of some of the African churches we now regard to as AICs, that is African indigenous churches. And they are very different from African newer Pentecostal churches who emerged from around the 1970s and 60s from various universities all across Africa and colleges in that sense. Added to that are African Caribbean churches, which are holiness and Pentecostal churches, which their formation will go back to some of the black churches in the United States, like New Testament Church of God in Christ, Church of God of Prophecy, of which there are several aspects of that as well. And lastly are African congregations within European mainline historic churches, such as your Church of England, for example, in the UK, or Baptist, or United Reformed churches, or congregational churches. And so you have African congregations in those spaces, whether in Sweden, or whether in Germany, or other in Amsterdam. You have African Christians attending these spaces as it is. So when we talk about African churches, or African Christians in the European space, we just need to understand that diversity, that we are not talking of a homogeneous group of churches, but diverse aspects of churches. And I think that diversity feeds into their theology, so that some actually embrace prosperity gospel, but there are other African churches that cannot stand prosperity gospel. Some are into what you might describe as a liberation theology. That is the idea that God is a God of justice and the God of the oppressed. But there are some who don't even have a clue what that is all about. Some are Sabbatarians. That is, they attend a church that focuses on the Sabbath in that sense. Some are oneness Pentecostal. That is, they believe that the idea of God is expressed not necessarily in the Father, Son, and the Spirit, but a different way of categorization. But there are also Trinitarians in that sense. What I'm simply saying is that there is a huge diversity within what we refer to as African churches. So that's the second point. We've talked about the history, we've talked about the diversity, and then lastly, I want to talk about how can you, Europeans, engage the African churches in the European space, or African Christians. Firstly, I would say we can minister to what we might be regarded as economic and political migrants. You know, those are terms that we use, not necessarily a categorization that I will use or like, but we'll go with it at the moment. And so we can minister to them. Some will do that. Some are doing that already across Europe, whether it's through migrant ministries, refugee ministries, ministering to asylum seekers, and etc. So that's like a ministry to economic or political migrants, those who are seeking refuge in the European space. So that's one way we can engage. A second one, to take it a notch higher level, is can we receive missionaries from Africa, from Caribbean? Because as much as we have economic and political migrants, we also have missionary migrants. That is, those of us who have come from Africa or the Caribbean, who have come as missionaries to the UK European space, because we see Europe as a mission field. Gone are the days where mission used to be from Europe to the rest of the world. The rest of the world have now come to Europe. And those that are coming, there are some that are coming as missionary migrants who have come to definitely preach the gospel and evangelize European space in that sense. And so what I'm saying is, let's not just only minister to political migrants, economic migrants. Let's receive missionaries from within this context in our churches, in our mission organizations. Let us encourage that in that sense. And then lastly is, can we develop multi-ethnic churches to reflect God's kingdom on earth? And again, that will mean in our churches, in our sphere, How is our church being intercultural at the congregational level, but also at the national level or at the leadership level? It's very important to think about these things as we continue this conversation, looking at dynamic gospel in the New Europe. It is my prayer that God will help you wherever you are on this journey to be able to engage Africans, diaspora in Europe. God bless you.
It's a wonderful privilege to be with all of you in this opportunity at the Lausanne gathering here in Europe and elsewhere. My name is Samuel Cueva, originally from Peru, and I am working as a mission consultant. I am a writer and developing what I call reciprocal collaboration mission theology. So the topic for this time, I would like to share with all of you, getting to know the diaspora and churches of Europe. And in my case, I will emphasize the Latin American diaspora churches of Europe. Let me introduce by saying that it is well known that Lausanne movement began in 1974 within a critical and decisive time for envisioning and strengthening world evangelization. The effect and influence of this important gathering has been followed by Manila 1989 and Cape Town 2010, where I had the big privilege to be there. These gatherings produce the Lausanne Covenant, the Manila Manifesto, and the Cape Town Commitment, all for getting better reciprocal collaboration on world evangelization. Now, within a different context, where pandemic reality has drastically changed many aspects for the Christian mission in Europe, I would like to share here that we have to interpret and understand what God wants for the church in Europe. So let me give you a very brief missiological synthesis of getting to know about the Latin American diaspora churches in Europe that may help to catalyze an innovative reciprocal collaboration for the Christians, for Christianity in Europe. Now I want to speak about of a historical background, the missionary dynamism from the margins, the world of poverty from the majority world has become influence in leading more and more the mission activity within the evangelical churches since the 1990s, especially from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Also, this reality shows that mission no longer has a view of geographical distance as it was in the past. Today, the mission activity includes the movement of people due to political, social, and economic needs. In other words, there is a diaspora movement working for God's kingdom that is making an increasing influence within the European mission context. I came to Europe in the 90s from my country, Peru. And first we went to work in Barcelona, Spain, and then we moved to London in 1997. So it will be 31 years of working in Europe, making a kind of contribution to the European churches and to learning together. So now I would like to speak and to bring to all of you a brief definition of diaspora missiology. For storming your brain, here I want to present a definition of diaspora missiology that is as follows. Diaspora missiology is the research, study, and practice of biblical and mission theology of people on the move in the light of God's redemptive mission. This academic field takes into account the macro and micro dimension of the global reality, as well as the uncertainty, possibility of changes that are involved in the church effort to understand what God is accomplishing today. So it has two fundamental tasks. First, to hold a Christological identity as it is pivotal center, and to a confidence in the triune God who is at work fulfilling his redemptive mission. And second, to develop an interdisciplinary approach as it relates theology to the fields of politics, economics, religious studies, sociology, geography, and history. I suggest going in depth of this definition for a wider understanding of the new mission scenario. Let me provide some case studies about the Latin American diaspora churches in Europe. According to the 2001 report of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, at least 5 million of Venezuelans have fled the country since 2014. In the case of Europe, the majority has reached Spain, Germany, and Sweden. People on the move are especially living in the capital of European countries, or within the cities they can find a job as cleaner, nanny, housekeeper, taxi driver, salesperson, or commerce. But the second generation, many are going to the university. Christian diaspora mission are mainly self-supported by a secular job. Venezuelan pastor in Madrid, for example, has the largest Latin American church of Spain with more than 1,500 members located in Madrid, as they have planted 60 churches and 18 of them in Europe. This is amazing. For the Latin American people coming to Europe, they have had preference to migrate to Spain, the United Kingdom, Italy, Germany, Netherlands, Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. To have an idea of what's going on in Europe, the Baptist Union of Germany has statistics of 201 migrant churches working on German soil. And 20 of them are Latin American speaking congregations. In the case of Sweden, thousands of Chilean refugees went to Sweden following the coup against President Salvador Allende in 1973. As a result, many independent churches, Spanish-speaking churches, began and few in collaboration with the Swedish church. In Belgium, British missionary Edith de la Melurie has an ethnic church in Ghent with a composition from the Latin American diaspora and some Belgians. In Spain, history of Latino congregations is different. From 5 members within a Spanish native congregation, one is a Latin American member, for example. Although there are Latin American congregations led by Latin American leadership, there are growing of integration where 2.5 million Latinos migrated to Spain, mainly Ecuadorians, Bolivians, Colombians, and Argentinians. The Christians and Missionary Alliance from Peru, for example, has sent Peruvian missionaries to Spain and the United Kingdom. This is fantastic. Also, we have to understand that, for example, PMI mission, they have helped missionaries from different Latin American countries and working especially in evangelism and church planting. France, in this sense, is very distinctive. The Assembly of God is predominant, and there are Peruvians and Brazilians working independently or in reciprocal collaboration with the French church. Now let me share about a missiological analysis in the case of the Latino churches in London. Currently, there are more than 40 Latino churches working within the 500,000 Latin American diaspora people living in the UK. The first Peruvian missionary, Edmundo Ravelo, arrived to the United Kingdom in 1979, and he has established the largest Latino congregation in London and has planted 5 daughters churches in Spain. Some of Latino churches are developing services in the English language with simultaneous translation during their services. They have gone from being an ethnic church to a multicultural church. In the case of the Brazilian work, there were 135 Brazilian churches in the United Kingdom. And because of the pandemic situation, they have decreased to 95. The largest Brazilian congregation, Catedral Internacional, has 1,500 members, and they have planted 20 daughter churches led by Senior Pastor Antonio Jackson. Although they have more than 4,000 members. Something worthy of recognition is the work of the Latin churches in London can be summarized in 3 aspects. First, the great majority of Latin pastors in London are bivocational. That is, they are self-supporting. Second, the vast majority have come through economic migration as asylum seekers or as immigrants seeking a better future for their lives. Some have become believers in Europe, while others came as believers from their countries of origin. The missiology here is one of diaspora, that is, a missionary force mobilized by God. We understand that without triumphalism, they could be part of the missionary combustion for mission in Europe. In fact, they are non-conventional missionaries. Many had no academic training in theological studies before beginning the pastorate, and others have been trained in the process of developing their ministry. Now, I would like to say one more, that is the third one. The great majority are what I would prefer to as unconventional missionaries, because they do not depend on the coverage of support of a church or a mission that has sent them. Rather, They are the new missionaries who, although they do not carry that title, are preaching the gospel, planting churches, and pastoring congregations in London. So now let me go to the conclusion. What can we say now? Well, for better mission service of the Latino churches in Europe, I suggest three aspects that are as follows. First, they need a theological formation for more effective ministry. Second, to establishing a two-way mission bridges between the European leadership and the Latin American traditional and non-conventional missionaries to strengthen the missionary task in Europe. And third one, most of the Latino churches are independent churches that they would be more integrated to the European church without missing the spontaneous combustion of the Spirit. Let me say finally, I believe that the dynamic gospel has power to transform lives within a post-pandemic, humanistic, and secular reality in Europe. There is hope for Europe. Let me say again, there is hope for Europe. So let's do it the work together for God's glory. Thank you so much for this time. Thank you.
Hello. Welcome to the Getting to Know the Diaspora Churches section. I'm going to talk about the Chinese churches in Europe. My name is Henry Liu. I'm the General Director of Chinese Overseas Christian Mission, COCM. Today, I'm going to talk about the Chinese churches. First, I'm going to talk about who are the Chinese diaspora in Europe composed of, and the basic demographics of them. Then we're going to ask the question, when did the Chinese churches begin, and her brief development history? And then how is the Chinese churches in Europe doing right now, and her relationship with the wider Christian community? And then the last question is, what are the Chinese churches' mission opportunities, aspirations, and challenges? So the first question is, who are the Chinese diaspora in Europe? And what does the composition and the basic demographics? There are two types of Chinese diaspora in Europe in general. One is the long-term migrants, and they have immigrated to the Europe, and they're living here now, long-term. And then there are some local-born community. Approximately 2 million to 2.3 million are the numbers in the whole of Europe. In UK, just to give you an example, the numbers range from a little bit over 440,000 to about 700,000. Now, why the difference? Because there are quite a few undocumented immigrants in the country, and that's true for a lot of the European countries. Then there's the transitional students that comes and goes. There's a large number of them. In Europe, there are different countries. For example, in UK, there are probably 150,000 Chinese students every year in the UK. And in France, there's probably 40,000. And then in Germany, 40,000, and Italy, about 8,000. Now, each country is different, but those are the largest numbers in the different countries. So you can see a sizable number. Now, in the UK alone, there will be about 150,000 that are from different countries. Chinese mainland, and then from Singapore, from Malaysia, from Hong Kong. Many of them are ethnic Chinese students. So there's a lot of transitional students in the UK and Europe. When did the Chinese church begin? And so the Chinese church began in earnest in 1950. That's when the Chinese Overseas Christian Mission, COCM, the mission organization that I work with, began. So that you can see is the beginning of the Chinese church in Europe. And last year, COCM celebrated its 70 years anniversary. So over the 70 years, COCM has been sort of beginning planting the Chinese ethnic Chinese churches. Of course, COCM is not the only agency that plants it, and in later years, quite a lot of other godly people from China and from around the world came and planted the Chinese church in continental Europe. So when 1950 COCM formed, the first church we planted was the Chinese church in London. So that's in 1951. And the second church will be the Chinese church in France. That will be in Paris. That's in 1961. And then in 1967, the Chinese church in Netherlands began. In 1978, the Chinese church in Scandinavia countries began. And 1979, the Chinese church in Italy began. And 1985, the Chinese church in Spain began, and so on and so forth. 1995, the Chinese church in Romania began. And so over the years, the church has been planted throughout Europe and the UK. Now, Chinese church is in all the major cities in Europe. And some of the larger cities like London, Paris, Madrid, Rome, there's many Chinese churches in one city. In London alone, there's more than 30 Chinese churches, ethnic Chinese churches. How is the Chinese churches in Europe doing currently, and her relationship with the wider Christian community? Now, the number of Chinese Christians in Europe is quite significant. I think there's about 25,000 Christians in continental Europe, and they are probably the number keep on changing. Probably 350 Chinese churches in all of continental Europe and UK. And among them, there are 47 parachurch organizations. Just to give you an example, in UK, each country is different. In UK, the Chinese churches, there are about 7,000 plus Chinese Christians. This is the number in 2019. Some numbers estimate up to 10,000. Now, it's hard to have a very exact number, but that's the range we're having. And in UK, we have about 160 churches and worship places, and 21 parachurch organizations. This is also a number in 2019. So there are quite a few large maturing Chinese churches and Chinese church systems. Now, when I say large maturing Chinese churches, I mean they have a fairly complete pastoral staff team and leadership team, stable membership, and then very healthy income church. Some may have church property, and participation in supporting in world mission. Now, one of this church is the Chinese church in London, the first church planted by COCM in 1951. And so the church has over 1,200 members in the church, and with multiple sites. Now, there are quite a few large churches, Chinese church throughout Europe, mostly in larger cities, such as in London, Manchester, Paris, Rome, Madrid, Berlin, and some other cities. But most Chinese churches are what I call mid-size and developing churches. And these are the churches that needs mostly, oftentimes, external pastoral support. And are probably recruiting pastors, and they're looking forward. They are, the congregation is smaller, maybe 100 to maybe 200-ish. And they're developing their co-worker team. Now, one such church example is the Mutant Chinese Christian Church here where I lived in England. Now, the church does not have a property yet. They rent the place, and there you can see it's adults and children, young people combined, maybe about 100 and plus. So that's a typical size of Chinese churches throughout UK and Europe. And so I will say the majority of the Chinese churches are that size. Then there's the new churches and fellowships developing, pioneering, mostly supported by missionaries, and then oftentimes special needs groups such as student fellowships or certain particular group of people that they're getting together. Oftentimes limited financial resources. One such church I can say is the Canterbury Chinese Christian Church in southern England, and the church has a small congregation, but quite a large student population because it's a university town and has a lot of students come and go. So that church and fellowship caters quite significantly to the student population. So there's a lot of student fellowships throughout Europe catering towards the Chinese students. There are strengths in Chinese churches. One of the strengths is there's strong cultural links and social bonds in Europe and within China, within Asia and China. So the relationship, family relationships between the congregants and their friends and families, both in Europe and UK, and also within China and Asia, it's very strong. So there's a lot of link between the Chinese church here and other places. And there's a diverse group across the economic stratas. Most of the congregation are quite diverse. There's some business people, some professionals, some restaurant owners, and some students, some young kids. So very much multi-generational. That's the one of the strengths of the Chinese churches. There are some weaknesses. Now, one of the weaknesses is there's oftentimes a shortage of trained pastors within the church, pastors, workers, and leaders. So it's constantly struggling for leadership. And also there's a complexity in the languages, even within the Chinese diaspora, there are different dialects. So here in UK, many Chinese churches are using 2 languages, English and Chinese, and 3 dialects, English and Mandarin, and then Cantonese. So and then also there's a transitional nature of the congregation in the Europe and UK. Quite a few people come and go, so the church is constantly in a transitional stage. Quite a lot of them. What are the Chinese church's mission opportunity, aspirations, and challenges? Now, one of the biggest possibilities and missional activities for the Chinese church is to welcome the new immigrants. There's a lot of new immigrants coming to Europe and UK from Asia, from China. And so there's a constant influx of families coming to work and doing business. So this creates a large opportunity for evangelism with the Chinese communities, new immigrants. And there's also, as I said, a large influx of Chinese students every year to UK and to continental Europe. So the student population is a very big ministry target for the Chinese churches. And also, because quite a few families has been settling down in the Europe, continental Europe, they're putting down roots. There are quite a few local-born Chinese growing up in Europe. Many of them are very talented, multi-talented, and so they are in business, they're in academia, some of them are even in government, and so they become a very strong influence for their neighbors. So another big thing is because the Chinese churches has taken roots in the continental Europe and UK, many Chinese churches have cross-cultural ministry witnesses with the local-born Chinese, the next generation, and with the first generation even. There are opportunities to do witness within Europe cross-culturally. So there are some key opportunities for Chinese churches. One is to reach the transient population that come and go, the students, the new immigrants. And also, when we do that, this influences the relatives and friends here in UK, Europe, also in Asia, in China. And particularly for the students, when they become Christians, when they are studying here through the Chinese churches, then they become leaders and to return to China. So that's a very big missional opportunity. There are many opportunities for immigrants because Chinese people were immigrants in Europe, in continental Europe. Even we put down roots here, but we also understand the immigrant mentality. So we can be immigrants that reach other immigrants cross-culturally. And so then we can become the salt and light in local communities in Europe. Now, I must also mention there's this new wave of British national overseas BNO holders from Hong Kong coming to the UK. I say there's a lot of transitional new immigrants coming to Europe. One of the biggest planned migration of Chinese, ethnic Chinese, is this wave from Hong Kong coming to UK. This started last year, and how many of those Hong Kong Chinese will come to UK? There are 5 million eligible to come. And for the first year, I think government estimates about 130,000 will come. And for the next 5 years, maybe 300,000 will come. Now, just for the first 9 months of this year, there are already 90,000 Hong Kong Chinese came to the UK. So you can see there's a large immigrant population coming to the UK. How the churches in UK can respond to this wave? Now, the churches in UK has been doing that already, dedicated ministries to help and welcome the Hong Kong people and enlarge the holding capacities of the church, of the Chinese churches, and we're aware of the cultural and political differences between Hong Kong immigrants and other currently UK Chinese diaspora. And there are new Cantonese worship services developed, and also kids and youth ministry developed for this group of people. Now, there is also a missional opportunity with this large group of Hong Kong people coming over here, because many of them are Christians, and they are moving to the UK and to live here. And if they become a strong force within the Chinese churches, then they can be a missional force to help the Chinese church grow in turn to reach the people locally. So there are many new churches can be planted because of this wave. Now here in the UK, the Chinese churches and the UK churches, the British churches, we have come together and formed this group called ukhk.org. It's a Hong Kong ready churches to welcome the Hong Kong people to coming over here and then help them to settle down and they would then become a missional force within UK, either to the Chinese population or to the British and Europeans cross-culturally. So here is the aspiration of the Chinese church in Europe, and it's also the slogan for COCM. It's called "Reaching the Chinese for Evangelism, for the good news of Jesus Christ," and then to reach Europe. And the Chinese population, Chinese Christian here, can help and reach the local people for the good news of Jesus Christ. Thank you. So I hope you can understand through this the Chinese church better, and we can pray for each other.